Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome the Chair of the Hemingway Foundation, John Barry.
Thank you. Thanks for coming and welcome on this cheerful July the 19th. Just 2 days away from Ernest's birthday, which is, if you recall, July 21st, 1899. Born just down the street in the birthplace home, which we still operate as a museum. Gosh, we're really very happy to have, for the second time, and I was not involved with the Hemingway Foundation when Gerald Kennedy was here on this occasion. I think he's at least 25 years ago. I was 12. No, actually, I am having a birthday today on the 19th, and I'm 78. So, give it up for the old man. J. Gerald Kennedy is Boyd Professor of English at Louisiana State University. He's the author of Imagining Paris, Exile, Writing, and American Identity, and co-author with a colleague known as Jackson Breyer of French Connections, Hemingway and Fitzgerald Abroad. He was advisory editor of the first 3 volumes of the letters of Ernest Hemingway. Some of you know that it's projected, I think, now to be, 14 volumes, and we're just publishing volume 6. So it's a long process. And that's under the general editorship of Sam Spanier. Sandy was a speaker here about, gosh, I'm going to say 8 years ago for the birthday lecture. She's Penn State University, where the letters are housed. Jerry's also co-editing a forthcoming volume of the letters, the final years, which there are 3 editors that Jerry said probably only the younger one will be there when we finish the volume. He's also, of course, an author of a number of essays on Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and Expatriate Paris. He edited modern short stories, sequences, composite fictions, and fictive communities. His publication on the 19th century American literature. Not only is he a Hemingway scholar, he's also a scholar of Edgar Allan Poe. And his writings include Poe, Death, and the Life of Writing. That was with a Guggenheim Fellowship. And that and the National Endowment, the Under Siege National Endowment for the Humanities. And he's working right now on a biography of Edgar Allan Poe. So, I'll get Jerry out here because he's really knows his stuff. And it's a great pleasure. He's a wonderful guy and a great scholar. So please welcome Gerald Kennedy.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi. It's an honor to be here again in Oak Park. And this is the centennial year for this book. This book, which I edited a few years ago for Norton with the idea that the centennial was quickly approaching. And it is, in fact, I was just explaining this to Keith, it's really through the happy process of creating this book that I got to know the editors at Norton and mentioned to one of them that I was working on a trade biography of Poe. And she passed me over to the trade side, and they gave me a contract. And all of this without an agent. So this is kind of, unheard of, but I hope to have this book done in a couple of years. But today I'm talking about Hemingway, and I work on Hemingway every week as well on the last volume of Letters, which I am co-editing with Michael Von Cannon, one of my former doctoral students at LSU, and also with Valerie Hemingway, who was your speaker here in 2019. And if any of you know Valerie, you know she's not just a wonderful person, but an amazing source of information about Hemingway, for whom she worked when she was 19 years old. That blows my mind. And served as his secretary in Spain and Cuba. So anyway, I'm very glad to be here. I recognize a few of you from the talk last night. Thank you for coming out again. And I was trying to think about how to pitch this. This is not an academic talk. A few of you may be teachers. Great. I hope you get some nifty ideas for teaching in our time. But if you are simply Hemingway fans, aficionados, that's the word you have to use if you're in Hemingway studies, I hope that this paper will give you a rich, clear sense of how this important and very complicated book came into existence. It's not an easy story, but I'm hoping that I will make it clear and interesting for you. So, 100 years ago, a young man from Oak Park was awaiting publication of his first book, his first real book, a collection of stories and vignettes called In Our Time. Characteristically, though, Ernest Hemingway was already pushing ahead on another project. Exactly 100 years ago, this July, he was traveling in Spain, furiously composing his first novel, The Sun Also Rises, in hotel rooms in Madrid and Valencia. The connections between these two books were both obvious and intricate. The obsession for bullfighting that seized Hemingway in Pamplona in 1923 provided a half-dozen vignettes for his story collection, and then crucially shaped the events of his first novel. His wounding on the Italian front in World War I, and his romance with a Red Cross nurse, which of course eventuated in A Farewell to Arms, tied In Our Time to The Sun Also Rises. So did his experience as a journalist, where he includes an eyewitness account in Our Time of the Greek evacuation from Thrace, as well as focusing on the newspaper work that Jake Barnes does in The Sun Also Rises. And then there is this striking difference between those first two books. The unmistakable presence of Hadley Hemingway as the wife in several of the In Our Time stories, and her disappearance, in fact, her deliberate removal from the original manuscript that would finally dramatize Jake's devotion to the insatiable Red Ashley. So here, after invoking the novel whose centennial is next year, I'm going to return back to my announced subject, the story collection after noting one more difference, and it's an important one. However modern, edgy, and disillusioned the characters of The Sun Also Rises appear to be, Hemingway's novel follows a linear chronology and reveals a coherent plot, unfolded by a mostly reliable narrator. Yes, there are a couple of boozy, surreal episodes and a bit of stream of consciousness narration, but the author resists radical experimentation. That cannot be said of In Our Time, a brash effort to create a literary work as fragmented as the modern art Hemingway was seeing in the Luxembourg Museum. Hemingway's first book contains some brilliant fiction, 3 or 4 of his greatest stories, but it is also a tough read for those who don't know what to expect. Figuring out the implicit scheme poses a challenge. Teachers, I don't know how many teachers there are in the audience today. A few? Good. Okay. Teachers sometimes explain In Our Time as a cubist collage, a pastiche of loosely connected scenes. A quick look at the actual contents, arranged as we encounter them, shows the many unpredictable shifts in setting and time, as well as in content and scale, that create the volume's palpable discontinuities. So, this is the only way, though, I could visually give you an idea of how this book fits together, if you don't know it. The pieces on the left are the longer tales. That which follows the little caret, the arrow, is the brief interchapter that gives you a quick flash of a scene, an action taking place. So we move through the volume, and we begin. The first Nick Adams story is Indian Camp. I think you had a reading and discussion of that Friday night. The great story that leads off the Nick Adams material in Our Time. It sets the baseline. And it is followed by a scene from the Greek evacuation from Thrace. Then the doctor and the doctor's wife. Followed by a World War I vignette, and so forth. And I'm not going to go through every one of these, but I will come back to highlight a few of the very curious juxtapositions. I'm going to circle back to this question of how the inner chapters relate to the stories, because it is such a fundamental concern. If you've never read this volume before, you plunge into it and you ask yourself, wait a minute, the last story was set in Michigan and it was about fishing, and now I'm looking at what? And this was an effect Hemingway deliberately cultivated. So as we go through this collection, we see that Hemingway is moving back and forth from tales, stories, longer stories, to short inner chapters. All the pieces on the right are very short. Typically, most of them are just a paragraph or so, not much longer. The tales run usually several pages. Hemingway borrowed his title for this whole collection from the Book of Common Prayer, a supplication to God for peace in our time. But the era he depicts from about 1909 to 1924 brackets the Great War of 1914 to 1918 with episodes of ethnic brutality and criminal violence, as well as the blood sport killing of 2,000-pound bulls. And you see that especially in the latter half of the collection. as the bullfighting material really starts to take over the inner chapters. I allude to the rough edges of In Our Time, published in October of 1925. Both to emphasize the shattered world of the post-war years and to suggest that Hemingway's jamming together of disparate materials marks a deliberate assault on conventional fiction, the elimination of a stable setting and a consistent point of view. The author liked to describe the difference between the longer stories and the miniatures to looking at a coastline from a ship and then zooming in using high-powered binoculars. But the reality is that there is no continuous coastline, and that close-ups magnify situations unrelated to the stories before and after them. For example, Hemingway's 3-Day Blow, about boys getting drunk on a rainy day in Michigan, and Nick's strange encounter with a washed-up boxer, the Battler, are linked by a grim account of Greek cabinet ministers being executed in 1922. Between the bucolic episodes that compose Big Two-Hearted River, we witness the hanging of Chicago gangster Sam Cardinella, who, according to the author, loses control of his sphincter muscle at the last moment. Like news bulletins, the intervening scenes of violence remind us that the global framework of In Our Time, they connect and disrupt at the same time. But how did In Our Time really take shape? Another slide shows the distinct stages in the composition process, beginning in 1922. Hemingway's first 3 completed stories were Up in Michigan, My Old Man, and Out of Season. And if you're saying to yourself, wait a minute, Up in Michigan? It's not in Our Time. It was dropped. I'll mention that later. What we see, though, in these first 3 stories is there's no Nick and there's no war. Hemingway did not discover his broad historical subject, the violence of the modern world, until he began writing the 18 prose poems he published the next year as lowercase In Our Time. For about 6 months, Hemingway made no progress on the larger collection. Then, after the birth of his son in Toronto in late 1923, he began a story he would call Indian Camp, bringing his young protagonist into the world and finding the direction of his book. It was the crucial breakthrough. Indian Camp let Hemingway link his summers in Michigan with his own initiation into the realities of sex and childbirth, life and death. He had no real connection to the boy in My Old Man, but he knew Nick Adams. Creating a stand-in let Hemingway fictionalize the story of his war experience, marriage, and expatriate life. And he added stories about others living in the post-war world, characters like and unlike Nick and his wife Helen. As Michael Reynolds has written, the writing of Indian Camp triggered a rush of stories exploding out of his head, perfectly onto paper, needing little revision. And if you look at that string of stories there, that second cluster, you see that Hemingway wrote those between, well, essentially between February and April. That's just an incredible surge. I don't care what you're writing. That is a lot of work, and it was a lot of brilliant work. Hemingway absolutely caught fire. He was on fuego. In 3 months, he wrote 8 stories that extended the book's thematic reach. By May, he began to imagine a capstone piece about Nick returning to Michigan after the war. Come back to that one, of course. That luminous story, as surprising as it may sound, that luminous story of Nick's recovery after all he had been through initially took a shocking experimental turn. And if you were at the discussion last night, I got into this a little bit, but here we go again. Today we call it metafiction. After tracing Nick's maturation from Indian camp through the doctor and the doctor's wife, the end of something, the 3-day blow, the battler and cross-country snow, Hemingway in Big Two-Hearted River did something pretty unthinkable. He exploded the illusion that Nick Adams was simply a fictional character, appearing in 6 earlier stories and 2 vignettes. He ended Big Two-Hearted River by disclosing that Nick himself was a writer. And I think I want to get ahead here. That Nick himself was a writer, the actual author of Indian Camp and My Old Man, as well as everything else in our time. I'll come back to the battler in a second. This is what we get into in On Writing. One of many interesting passages. The only writing that was any good was what you made up, what you imagined. That made everything come true. Like when he wrote My Old Man. This is Nick Adams on the Big Two-Hearted River talking about writing one of the stories you just read. So this is a kind of mind-blowing turn. The focus shifts from that beautiful, idyllic landscape of northern Michigan, the beauty of the Big Two-Hearted River, the trout swimming in the stream. It shifts completely to the interior, to what's going on in Nick's head. Nick in the stories was never himself. He made him up. Of course, he'd never seen an Indian woman having a baby. There goes Indian camp. That was what made it good. He knew that. He'd seen a woman having a baby on the road to Karagach and tried to help her. That was the way it was. So this was the first version of Big Two-Hearted River. And if those of you who know this collection and know how it's arranged, think about where Hemingway was going to go after he had kind of turned the contents inside out. I mean, it's like taking a purse and pulling the inside of it outside. Have a look at this, everybody. All those stories that were drawing you in to the life of Nick Adams, guess what? I made it all up. And he includes himself. He made him up. Of course, the Nick in the stories was never himself. We learn that Nick lives in Paris with his wife Helen and does his best work as a writer when he's dealing with marital discontent and friction. Like Hemingway, he knows Ezra Pound, James Joyce, and Gertrude Stein. He has also spent his summers on Walloon Lake in Michigan, and his best fishing buddy is, incredibly enough, Hemingway's old pal from St. Louis, Bill Smith. This is the guy in 3-Day Blow. Nick brutally concludes that he has lost his male friends by getting married, putting that ahead of fishing. Imagine. In Europe, Nick has also become enamored of bullfighting, and like Hemingway, he wants to write the way that Cezanne painted. The original ending reveals a Nick Adams indistinguishable from Hemingway. But the real author further complicates this doubling by claiming that, as I've already showed you, Nick in the stories was never himself. The fictional character has fictionalized himself. This is less a narrative rough edge than a shocking turn to surrealism. It's as if Hemingway suddenly throws up a funhouse mirror that the reader has to confront at the end of this volume. The experimental version of Big Two-Hearted River was not, of course, the one that the world came to know and love. When he showed the story to Gertrude Stein, her harsh judgment stunned him. The mother of literary invention told him to ditch the mental conversation because, and this is Stein's quote, remarks are not literature. I can just see Hemingway writhing, when he got this news. Hemingway was so abashed that he wrote immediately to two friends, Don Stewart and Robert McAllen, both of them shopping the manuscript with New York publishers. Ernest claimed to have made a sudden, horrifying discovery that his dive into the consciousness of Nick Adams was all fecal matter. That's a nice Oak Park euphemism. There's not a word here about Gertrude Stein told me to change this. Something you can't say. Oh, this woman who's been teaching me how to write, she said this stuff really wasn't going to work. He gave them a revised ending to substitute for the last 11 pages of Big Two-Hearted River. Hemingway brought the story back to the straight fishing, a supremely controlled exercise in recovering an old pastime. But Hemingway was not yet out of the woods. Boney and Liv Wright sent him a contract in March 1925, insisting that he remove the sexual innuendo in Mr. and Mrs. Eliot, conveyed by that naughty phrase, trying to make a baby. Yeah. Just think. And the publisher found Up in Michigan entirely unsuitable in content, demanding a replacement. Hemingway should have known. 3 years earlier, Stein told him that the story about a burly blacksmith forcing himself on a housemaid was inapprochable, something that could not be hung up on a wall, displayed in public. Although Hemingway had, in 1925, just written The Undefeated, a story about an old bullfighter, he would save that piece for his next volume of tales, and instead he composed from scratch The Battler. This story about the washed-up boxer and his black companion advanced Nick's education in racial difference, queer affection, and tough love. It also brought his volume to the edge of violence, for Hemingway inserted it into the sequence just before Chapter 6, Nick's Wounding. This vignette provides the only explicit evidence that the central character of In Our Time was wounded on the Italian front. It produces a fundamental turn in the larger story. The larger story Hemingway is telling. Apart from the sketch on the quay at Smyrna, which was added 5 years later, the story collection was, by April 1925, complete and ready for publication. But the book that appeared that year, after the elimination of Hemingway's lurch into metafiction, still posed a reading challenge and offered only tenuous coherence. The author had converted 2 of the 1924 In Our Time vignettes into stories, not by revising or lengthening them, but simply by converting them from Italian to Roman type. I should take just a second here to note again how critical this one little inner chapter is. Hemingway was using a minimalist method, trying not to elaborate the big emotional subjects that underlay the entire narrative. And these few lines, if you blow past them and don't pay attention, you miss the fact that Nick was at the front, that he was very badly wounded. And missing that changes the way you read Big Two-Hearted River at the end. You have to connect. And so Hemingway, in fact, did rebalance the collection of stories by taking 2 of his inner chapters from the In Our Time lowercase vignettes that he had published in 1924. That's In Our Time, no caps. This is one of those things that Hemingway scholars love to, fuss about. Do you mean In Our Time, 1924 or 25? The stories of Nick and Harold Krebs, which is the story Soldier's Home, are connected loosely by a piece called A Very Short Story. It provides a link in the sardonic account of an unnamed soldier who has been wounded at the front, has fallen in love with a nurse, and then back home received a crushing letter calling their affair meaningless. Well, that was very close to what Hemingway had experienced when he came back home to Oak Park in 1919, getting a letter from Agnes Wine-Kurowski that their relationship had just been a boy and girl affair. And it all gets boiled down here. That is Agnes on the left in that image. If the writing of Indian Camp set in motion the creative surge of Nick's stories that solidified In Our Time, it was the composition of Cat in the Rain in February, March, and Soldier's Home in April that developed a strategy of pairing, building the collection along parallel lines, weaving the Nick stories into a sequence that might just accommodate the earlier stories not tied to the Nick saga, My Old Man and Out of Season. Paul Smith even suggests that Hemingway had probably started to write Cat in the Rain in Genoa when he was writing Out of Season, that earlier story. That April 1923 story, which you may already know about the messy fishing expedition with the drunken guide, it's a story about poor communication at the very least. That story about an awkward illicit fishing trip creates a rift between the unnamed husband and wife. Hemingway, then adjusting to Hadley's pregnancy, was perhaps already imagining a set of stories about expatriate couples with uneasy marriages. In 1924, he added a nasty satire, Mr. and Mrs. Elliot, I'll come back to this in a minute, and the story Cross Country Snow, revealing Nick's misgivings about Helen's pregnancy, which figured to limit his outdoor fun with male buddies. When Hemingway began working, back at the beginning, in 1922, on the separate shorter pieces that might make a book, he had almost no idea where he was going. He planned to write about what he had experienced since leaving Oak Park, whether in Kansas City or Paris, at the Italian front, covering the Greek expulsion from Thrace, or watching Spanish bullfights. He wanted to face facts, confront his own disillusionment, and strip away the pieties and euphemisms of his parents, telling stories that epitomized the modern moment. The vignettes gave his sequence historical and geographical scope. The stories explored the complications of living in our time. But despite ingenious critical efforts to explain the unity of in our time, we confront several obstinate problems, what I call the rough edges. The disproportionate attention to bullfighting in the latter half of the book, the anomalous function of the interchapter, The Revolutionist, the mean, homophobic needling of Mr. and Mrs. Eliot, and the utter incongruity of My Old Man, the Sherwood Anderson knockoff about a crooked American jockey and his naive son who moved from Italy to France but seem untouched by either the Great War or their own American origins. The Revolutionist was the other vignette transformed into a story, but its account of a shy, art-loving Hungarian Marxist who lands in a Swiss jail barely fits the book's scheme. Following soldiers home, Mr. and Mrs. Eliot continues the mockery of Hemingway's parents. Yes, it's a satire of a specific guy in Paris that Hemingway disliked, but there's another layer. It's a satire of his father's sexual prudery and his mother's attachment to a female music student. But it depicts expatriate Paris only fleetingly. My Old Man includes sidewalk scenes at the Café de l'Opéra, but represents only racetracks, street vendors, and cheap toys. Apart from confirming the ubiquity of post-war corruption and the fallibility of fathers, My Old Man seems oddly positioned, or at least it always has to me, between cross-country snow and Big Two-Hearted River, two Nick stories. Joe Butler lacks the interest or experience of Nick Adams. He has, until his father's death, never lost his gosh and golly innocence, and even the discovery of his father's dishonesty seems to blunt rather than sharpen the impact of his death. This is the sum of Joe's hard new knowledge. Quote, "Seems like when they get started, they don't leave a guy nothing." Fortunately, Hemingway does not leave us with nothing with Juvenile Confusion at the Otoyo racetrack. After a vignette about the death of the bullfighter Naira, he takes us back to Nick, plunging us more fully into a life marked by war, troubled relationships, and hard decisions. Big Two-Hearted River traces the solitary post-war return of Nick to the scenes of his youth. As Hemingway liked to point out, and this is the Big Two-Hearted River, the Two-Hearted River in Michigan. As Hemingway liked to point out, the story evokes the war without even mentioning it. Nor does it allude directly to Nick's wound, his marriage, or his emerging family. But the burned-over landscape and charred grasshoppers present a devastating no man's land, and Nick's avoidance of risk, his fear of decisions, whether to flip a pancake or fish in the swamp, implies a persisting anxiety. What Nick most wants to avoid is thinking, evoking past trauma. In the story's final version, Nick's literary ambition surfaces only once. He felt he had left everything behind. The need for thinking, the need to write, other needs. That's it. That is the only hint we get that Nick might be a writer. Like Harold Krebs, he wants to avoid consequences, emotional complications. He fears a tragic adventure. His journey into the natural world to complete a therapeutic ritual, fishing for trout, connects his story with two others in the collection and produces a satisfying sense of closure. Finally, I'll come to the conclusion myself. Finally, In Our Time works not because of its just jarring juxtapositions or shifting multiple scenes, but because of the steady, simple refrains that emerge from the confusion. These haunting melodic phrases remain almost inaudible, arising from the recurrence of objects and actions. When Nick stops to put a reel on his fishing rod and thread the line through the guides in Big Two-Hearted River, he repeats the exact action of the husband in Out of Season. Quote, "The young gentleman sat down on the bank and joined up a rod, put on a reel and threaded the line through the guides." Multiple readings of In Our Time disclose many commonplace, recurrent details that insinuate subtle connections. Here's another. I mentioned this the other night, last night actually. When the solitary Nick munches his canned apricots meditatively in Big Two-Hearted River, the simple act evokes the moment in 3 Day Below, when during a drinking spree with Bill, he knocked a pan of soaking apricots off the kitchen table and then gathered them back into the pan to show his sobriety. Coffee making, according to Hopkins, acquires meaning in Big Two-Hearted River, as does the social cup of coffee Bugs offers Nick in The Battler. Drinking wine signifies differently in Mr. and Mrs. Elliot, Out of Season, and Cross-Country Snow. So does eating buckwheat cakes in Soldier's Home and Big Two-Hearted River. Think about the importance of beds in Indian Camp, The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife, Cat in the Rain, and Mr. and Mrs. Elliot. Or jackknives in Indian Camp, The Battler, and Big Two-Hearted River. Think of Hemingway's recurrent shotguns and rifles, shoes and boots, horses, rowboats, carts, and trains. Banal details from everyday life don't ordinarily count as themes and can always be dismissed as coincidental or trivial. But in our time, commonplace objects quietly provide cohesion, linking the disparate stories and vignettes. Hemingway puts a modernist brand on his collection. The image here makes this point. Using the visual language of Cubist collage, defying expectation from the outset, he plays continuity against discontinuity, using subliminal resonances to give In Our Time a steadying feel of familiarity. And after 100 years, it still works. Thank you. Well, I hope I haven't exhausted your patience. If you have any questions you'd like to raise, Carl? Yeah.
So you mentioned that they added a story 4 years after the book was written. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Do you think that was significant?
Yes, the question has to do with the story that was added to In Our Time after its first publication in 1925. The Boney Liverite edition did not have on the K at Smyrna. And when Hemingway, as some of you know, famously jumped ships while he was waiting for In Our Time to come out. He jumped from write to Scribner's. And Scribner's finally acquired the rights to In Our Time and brought out their own edition in 1930, but wanted something a little special to give it some panache, something that wasn't in the first edition. So they asked Hemingway to dig, and he rummaged and found this little piece that he had actually, if memory serves, I think he composed it actually in 1927. But it is clearly rooted in that what must have been a pretty traumatic experience of visiting Greece and Turkey, Thrace, during the middle of the Greek-Turkish War, and watching a horrendous evacuation of the Greek population. The Turks wanted them out, all of them out, and they were forced, literally at gunpoint, to move off the land. So Hemingway saw that, and that's what he came up with, and thematically it works pretty well. So we're not troubled by that. It doesn't disrupt. It kind of signals cruelty, death, war, brutality, etc., etc.
If you could just take the slides back, one or two slides,
Sure.
to the image of Ag and Hemingway there.
Yes. Yeah.
Does anyone else see this in his profile picture? A young Tom Cruise. That smile is exact. I wonder if Tom Cruise cultivated it.
And that film, that Hemingway and Love and War, captures some of that intensity. And the really the interesting thing is that Hemingway's recognition that this was a key experience for him, something he had to talk about, but he really hadn't figured it out. He didn't. Emotionally, he's still too fried by Agnes's letter to do much with it except to write this really nasty satire, which I didn't have space to put the whole thing here, but as you may know, if you are familiar with this piece, it ends with contracting a case of gonorrhea in the backseat of a Chicago taxi cab. So it's a very deflationary piece. When it starts, you can see, oh yes, this will become a farewell to arms. This is the great romance between the soldier and his nurse. But by the time we get to the end of it, it's pretty. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Did Gertrude Stein give the final book her blessing? Did she feel it was a great book, or did she still have reservations?
The question is, did Gertrude Stein give her blessing to this book, or did she have reservations?
The final book.
The final version. Well, the reality is that about the time this book was published, Hemingway's relationship with Gertrude Stein was collapsing. And Hemingway very much wanted her to write a review of In Our Time. I mean, he'd done a lot of revision because she pushed him to do it. And then she never wrote the review. He was pretty ticked. Their relationship was never as cordial again. In fact, for a while, it was kind of complete avoidance. They did briefly get together, I think in 1929, but it was never that kind of friendly relationship that existed in 1922. There's a wonderful letter that Hemingway wrote to. This is in the volume 2, I believe, of the letters, written on Valentine's Day, 1922, I think back to his parents, talking about a wonderful visit that they've had with Gertrude Stein. It's so charming. And I don't know if any of you know anything about Stein's home in Paris or the paintings that she collected. She had a wonderful apartment on the Rue de Fleurus that was filled with incredible artwork. I mean, artwork that today would be worth $1 gazillion. And this is where she entertained Hemingway and Hadley and served them tea and talked about painting and talked about writing. And Hemingway was very respectful to Stein and really appreciated her mentorship. But as I pointed out in those letters that he sent back to Don Stewart and Bob McCowan, there's no way he was going to say, well, Gertrude told me to do this, that this on-writing stuff is a train wreck, so get rid of it. By the way, I should point out, and I'm not trying to sell books, but the Norton Critical Edition, there are flyers in the back. If you would like to pick one up, I think you can get a small discount. It's not a very expensive book, but one of the really important pieces in that book is the inclusion of on writing. It's not as part of In Our Time, but as a piece that is really eye-opening, especially if you know the whole story. And I tried to give you the whole story of this almost catastrophic mistake that Hemingway tumbled into. And, I mentioned this last night. I had really not thought about this before until I was rereading the story and rereading On Writing. But this wonderful story about how Nick doesn't want to think, wants to close off, all the stuff that's in his head. And Hemingway provided, after the fact, the explanation. Well, what he didn't want to think about was the war. And, there's a lot in the story that supports that. And, I don't doubt that was part of the motive. But what Nick was also thinking about was all the stuff that spilled out in On Writing, that just spewed out for pages and pages. He left the fishing behind and started going on and on about Spanish bullfighters that he admired, or Cézanne's painting, or all of his pals in Paris, and the kind of jokes they liked and the kind of jokes they didn't like. None of it has anything to do with what's going on in Big Two-Hearted River. But it's a very strange... I truly don't understand where Hemingway thought he was going in ending that. If he ended Big Two-Hearted River with the piece On Writing, I don't know what people would have made of the book. I mean, it's such a bizarre turn to, introduce you to this fictional character and story by story, give you little episodes in his life, lead you to a place where you are very well positioned by the time you start Big Two-Hearted River to understand what's really under the surface of this story. But what Hemingway was thinking of doing was, it's like a therapy session. It's, this mental conversation of Nick Adams. And it would have utterly changed the impact of the book. So I think, from a practical standpoint, Stein was Stein nailed it. I mean, it was a great, smart move, and it was smart of Hemingway to take her advice and not to say, well, I'll show her. You know, she's just trying to close me down because this is too experimental. So, you know, to me, this is one of the most interesting moments I know of in American literary history. Is this this train wreck that Hemingway dodges at the end of In Our Time.
I was just wondering whether there are any theories as to any contemporary novels at the time that might have influenced Hemingway to go shoot off in that direction. Anything that any other writers who were experimenting like that, he may have picked up on it and decided to try it?
Well, honestly, you know, the only thing that came to mind as I read it was that Hemingway and Stein herself were certainly surrounded in Paris by the Surrealist group. Andre Breton's novel, Nadja, has a kind of metafictional aspect to it. It's a fictional character, but, you know, where is she? And is she a real character or not? I don't know. I mean, Hemingway, he did spend time hanging out with, not Max Ernst, but with the photographer. Yeah, he spent time with Man Ray, and he did know a few of the Surrealists. I think he had, you know, some sense of the way that they were trying to use the new sort of material that was being provided for them by modern psychiatry, trying to understand the relationship between consciousness and unconsciousness. They were really the first literary group to actively work on kind of opening up that problem, creating literary works that help to explain or help to make real the relationship between the unconscious, dreams, and real life. And I don't know. That's a long way of saying I just don't know. Yes, sir.
Hello. You mentioned a bullfighter story that Hemingway was working on contemporaneously.
Yes.
Stories in Our Time.
Yes.
But didn't include Till Later Life. Did that become The Undefeated?
Yes, it did. Absolutely. Yeah. So it appeared in Men Without Women in 1927. And, you know, it's interesting to think that Hemingway was already charging ahead in 1925 with what would be his next collection. I mean, he was writing The Sun Also Rises, and he was also thinking about this next collection of stories. And in many ways, you know, at the very end of In Our Time, you get that story of the death of Maillard. And The Undefeated really, you know, would resonate pretty well with that. But he scrapped it, and he saw an opportunity to stick another Nick Adams story in a pivotal place. And it's just before this sequence that includes the Nick wounding. So he's on the cusp of violence in The Battler. And that's where we're going. Yeah.
Thank you.
So there were just 2 editions of In Our Time, the lowercase one, and then the later Scribners.
Well, there have been multiple editions of the, you know, the book that I've edited. I mean, Scribners has brought it out a number of times, and now we're into reprints by other publishers.
I meant the content.
The contents, no. Just those 2 books. The 1924 In Our Time was published in Paris as a chapbook. It's not many pages long. There were 18 little prose poems, and you can sit down and read through it in about 20 minutes or less. But it really gave Hemingway a kind of repository or sort of a storehouse for pieces that he could use. And he sequenced the stories pretty much following the chronology of In Our Time. He did move things around a little bit, but yeah, that was a critical phase. But he had written most of the In Our Time pieces before he went to Canada with Hadley in September of 1923. That was pretty much, as they say in Hollywood, in the can, and ready to be published in 1924. So when they left for Canada, Hemingway just had this long stretch where he'd gotten all of these short pieces put together, but he really wasn't sure where he was going from there. And I think it was beginning to wear on Hemingway, really beginning to get to him. And Toronto made it worse. I don't know if you've ever looked at that collection of the letters, those months when they were in Toronto. Hemingway's letters are so angry. He hated the people who were bossing him around at the Toronto Star. I mean, he had some friends, but he disliked some of the editors, and he just found the atmosphere in Canada uncongenial, and was so eager. But it was in that moment, just after Hadley had given birth to John Hadley Nicanor Hemingway, a.k.a. Bumby, that he began to write this story about a young guy named Nick Adams, whose father is a doctor. Wait a minute, there's a pattern here. And he's going to an Ojibwe camp to help a woman have a baby.
There's a little framed piece of his own writing, handwriting from the study in high school at Will Parker and Forrest describing some of his favorite flowers. But then also his three favorite authors, O. Henry, Kipling, and the third one, Stewart. But and then he says his intention is to travel and to write those, because you were just wanting to see, have you seen in all of your readings where that influence of O. Henry or Kipling in somebody's writing?
In our archives, we have, when Hemingway was a very young boy, he wrote a biography.
Yeah.
To his student, to his teacher, basically said his favorite authors were O. Henry, Stewart, and Kipling. And he's asking him, did you see any influences in Hemingway's writing from those authors?
I'm sure there are. I mean, all of us, kind of metabolize what we read, and then consciously or unconsciously repeat it, echo it. Are there any moments when I can clearly see, oh, that's an O. Henry kind of thing? Honestly, I think by the time Hemingway was in Paris in the 1920s, his reading interests had changed a lot. I think he was reading contemporary authors. He was going to Sylvia Beach's bookstore. He was reading the Russians on the advice of Ezra Pound. Reading Flaubert even, and Maupassant. And so those are maybe some of the influences that I would see. I mean, the interest in Turgenev, which has been much noted, And of course, Turgenev's famous work, Fathers and Sons, actually resonates in a Hemingway story. But it's that interest in the countryside, in the way people live in the world, and how the country affects the way we feel. I think he gets some of that from Turgenev, and of course a big part of it from Cézanne, from visual art, from the way that the painters at that time were really creating a new language, a new visual language for how we see the world, how we feel about it. It was an incredibly exciting moment. It was, Hemingway's dumb good luck. I say that simply because he had no idea when he jumped on a boat to sail to France what was going on. But he soon found out. Stein helped him a lot. And I think there's just so much in our time that is connected to the visual experimentation, the painting that was all around him in Paris. And that last image that I had of the collage, I think that just captures that seeing the world as something fragmented, something we can't see as a continuous, coherent thing anymore. It's a jumble. And that's kind of the emotional, historical sentiment that I think surges through the collection in our time. Yes?
So this is about your, okay, sure. This is about your teaching and research at LSU. Is there a reason that institution attracted a Hemingway scholar, or were you already there before you decided to become one? And is there a difference in the students who are attracted to your Hemingway work compared to those that are interested in the rest of the literature you teach?
Well, I should say first, I took the job at LSU because it was there, and it was the first year, and I won't go back, but we're talking about a time 50 years ago, when the job market for PhDs in English had suddenly turned incredibly difficult, and I felt unbelievably lucky. I spent my whole career at LSU. So, there are difficulties in Louisiana. And certainly the students who come through LSU are probably a little different from the students who go to University of Michigan or Michigan State or Illinois. But I found the students to be very receptive to Hemingway, certainly receptive to Poe too. It's a different... I could see the goth movement coming when I started teaching a certain Poe class. It was like they're coming out of the woodwork. There must be some scuttlebutt. Anyway, no, I had a lot of really terrific students who were interested in Hemingway. And, Hemingway is an unbelievably interesting character. And the fact that, he came from this, what was then, a kind of small village, I think, virtually, on the outskirts of Chicago. When Hemingway talks about heading out into the prairie, that seems to me inconceivable today. And John was pointing out, you now have some skyscrapers beginning to crop up in Oak Park. Unbelievable. But there's a lot in Hemingway's struggle that is attractive to especially people who want to become writers. He was fiercely attached to what he did. He took it very seriously. If you look at the letters of Ernest Hemingway, you may be disappointed to find how many of them simply consist of like page counts of how many, how much work he was able to get. I wrote X number of words today. Again and again and again, he would keep track of things like that. And he was passionate about writing. And I think for young people who want to become writers, that's a great model. It took him to unusual places. It encouraged him to dive into experiences that were unfamiliar. That trip to Thrace was a total eye-opener for Hemingway, I'm sure. It surfaces even again as late as the mid-1930s in the snows of Kilimanjaro. That experience is still embedded in Hemingway's consciousness. I don't know if that answered your question, but I found teaching both of those writers attractive, and as I think about, why am I attracted to Poe and to Hemingway? I guess they're both kind of preoccupied with death in different ways, and yet they kind of bookend the modern moment. Yeah. Question?
Yes. Thank you. So just more of a question. And would you say this is like representative of the sentence structure in this book in our time? And the reason I say that is because I read The Sun Also Rises, and the Sea, and From Whom the Rose Falls.
Yeah.
And I remember in the prologue of all those, they always said, this is Hemingway, being very brief, scratching the surface, the emotions underneath.
Right.
But then when you read the book, there's just a lot of run sentences that are very descriptive. I see all that as the short sentences that, so I saw that excerpt, and it seemed to me that it was shorter.
Yeah, I pulled this one up just to underscore the point you're making.
Yes.
That in these early stories and in our time, Hemingway was very much enamored of an idea of what he later called omission.
Okay.
Leaving out key details deliberately, not to create mystification, but to create intensity, to imply things that a good reader can sense. And so, I think it's one of the reasons why Big Two-Hearted River is such a wonderful story. There's so much understatement, so much restraint, such a deliberate refusal to go into details, to provide explanations. What we get are the physical details, the simple acts of doing this and doing that. It's up to us as readers to understand why this matters. And by the time we get to Big Two-Hearted River, Hemingway has sort of trained us to understand what it means to look down in the stream and see those trout. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Last question.
Thank you, Jerry. How long after
in our time that Hemingway first sort of verbalized the iceberg, so-called iceberg effect. It's obviously clearly at work.
I am trying to recall whether there is anything explicit in any of the letters from the mid-20s. I don't think so. Maybe. But a lot of this, frankly, became more sharply focused for us when we read A Movable Feast. And this was, of course, at the very end of Hemingway's career. That, to me, is one of the miracles of A Movable Feast, that Hemingway was able to escape from the kind of cumbersome style that he had fallen into with some of his later books, and to recover one last time this kind of tight, intense, restrained prose style that is so apparent in his very first book. That's a great question, and you've caught me flat-footed, and I don't know the right answer to that question, but it makes me want to go back and do some digging. Thank you, John.
All right, everybody. On behalf of the Norton community and the Hemingway Foundation, we want to thank Professor Kennedy for joining us for our Hemingway celebration this year and our theme in commemorating the 100th year anniversary of the American debut of Hemingway in our time. Our program will continue. We've got a porch concert this evening. If you want to join us for that, we're going to be acknowledging our student scholarship recipients as well. And we also have a concert in the park tomorrow in Scoville Park as well. In the evening. You can find more information on our website. Again, thank you.
Thank you.